accidentally found my late husband's old bank account. There was $33 million in it. But my husband always said we were poor and his salary was $500 a month. When I called the bank, the manager answered with 3 words. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Anaya again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say, you. What they never tell you is that sometimes grief opens a door you never knew existed. And behind that door is a room full of lies. My name is Carol Whitmore. I'm 53 years old. I live in a modest 2-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio. And for 26 years I was married to a man I thought I knew completely. His name was Richard. He died 14 months ago from a heart attack. Sudden, quiet, unremarkable. The way he lived, the way I always believed we both lived. We were not wealthy. That was the foundation of our life. Together. The thing I accepted early and never questioned. Richard worked as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a regional trucking company. His salary, he told me, was around $500 a month when we first married, rising slowly over the years to somewhere around $2,200 by the time he retired at 61. We clipped coupons. We vacationed at state parks. We drove used cars. When the washing machine broke in 2019, we argued for 3 days about whether to repair it or replace it, and we repaired it because replacement felt like an extravagance we couldn't afford. I taught part-time at a community college, English composition, 2 or 3 courses a semester. My income was modest but steady. Between the two of us, we got by. We were comfortable in that particular American way that looks like contentment from the outside, but feels, if you're honest, like a careful permanent restraint. Richard was a quiet man, not cold. He laughed at his own jokes. He brought me coffee on Saturday mornings without being asked. He remembered my mother's birthday when I forgot. But he kept things close. I thought it was his nature. I thought it was what made him calm, reliable, steady. I never thought it was what made him a liar. He had a sister, Patricia Whitmore Hayes, 58, married to a man named Doug Hayes, who sold commercial real estate in Scottsdale, Arizona. Patricia and Richard were close in a way that always made me feel slightly outside something I couldn't name. They called each other every Sunday. They had private jokes I was never included in. When Richard died, Patricia arrived before the ambulance had even left our street. She stood in my kitchen, opened my refrigerator without asking, and made herself a cup of tea. I told myself she was grieving. I told myself I was being uncharitable. The paperwork after Richard's death was manageable. He had a will, modest, unsurprising, the house to me, a small life insurance payout, $45,000, which covered the funeral and a portion of what we owed on the HVAC system. His 401k, which contained $18,000. That was it. That was the estate of Richard Allen Whitmore, as I understood it. I spent several months moving through the administrative fog of widowhood, canceling accounts, notifying Social Security, sorting through his belongings, which I did slowly, reluctantly, in the way you do when every object still smells like the person you lost. It was in October, 14 months after his death, that I found the envelope. I was clearing out the top shelf of his home office closet, a task I'd been avoiding since the beginning, because that shelf held the things he cared about most. His father's watch, a folder of old photographs, the deed to the house. I was looking for the deed, actually, because I was refinancing. My hand went to the back of the shelf, past a shoebox I assumed contained receipts, and touched something that slid. A manila envelope unsealed tucked flat against the wall. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a bank statement, issued by First Meridian Private Bank, Chicago, Illinois. The account holder was listed as R. K. Whitmore. The statement was dated March 2021, 18 months before his death. The balance on that statement was $33,241,780.04. I sat down on the closet floor. I sat there for a long time. The afternoon light shifted. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked. I read the number again and one more time after that. $33,241,780.04. $780.04. My husband, who argued with me about a washing machine, had $33 million in a private bank account in Chicago. I don't know how long it took me to stand up and walk to the kitchen. I know I poured myself a glass of water and didn't drink it. I know I sat at the kitchen table for another hour. And then, because I am the kind of woman who, when confronted with something impossible, reaches for a practical action, I picked up my phone and called the number printed on the statement. The phone rang twice. A man answered, composed, professional, measured. First Meridian Private Bank. "This is Gerald Bloom." I told him my name. I told him my husband's name. I told him I had found a statement and I needed to understand what I was looking at. There was a brief pause. Not the pause of surprise, the pause of a man choosing his words carefully. Then Gerald Bloom said exactly 3 words. He left instructions. I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. He left instructions. I must have said something after that, asked something residential pond somehow, because the call lasted another 4 minutes. But I have no memory of those 4 minutes. What I remember is hanging up in Ohio, holding a phone that had just rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own life. Gerald Bloom had been carefully uninformative. He'd confirmed the account existed. He'd confirmed Richard was the account holder. He told me that in order to discuss the specifics of the account and any associated documents, I would need to come in person to the Chicago branch with proof of identity, Richard's death certificate, and documentation of my status as his surviving spouse. He'd been polite. He'd been precise. And he had said absolutely nothing about what those instructions were, who else might be aware of them, or why my husband had spent 26 years telling me we were struggling to make ends meet while quietly sitting on a fortune. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed Richard and I had shared for 2 decades, and I stared at the ceiling, and I did what grief had temporarily suspended, but couldn't stop forever. I thought about the washing machine. Thought about the vacations we hadn't taken because we couldn't afford them. I thought about my mother's surgery in 2017 when she needed a hip replacement and didn't have adequate insurance. And I had called Richard from the hospital parking lot and cried and said I didn't know how we were going to help her. And he had held my hand that night and said, "We'll figure something out, Carol. We always do." And we had scraped together $4,000 from our joint savings to cover the gap. And, as a gift, and I had been moved and grateful, and Richard had accepted it with a strange flatness, like a man enduring something rather than receiving something. The way Doug Hayes, her husband, always deflected when the subject of money came up, changed the subject with a particular skill of a man who'd been told to. Did Patricia know? I wrote that question at the top of the page and circled it 3 times. By 6 a.m., I had 2 pages of notes and a weight in my chest that sat somewhere between grief and fury. The grief was Old. It had been there since Richard died, and it didn't leave now, but the fury was new, and it was clean, and in a strange way it was useful. It had edges. Pointed somewhere. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. I was a 53-year-old part-time English instructor who had spent her adult life managing a modest household. I didn't have a lawyer on retainer. I didn't have wealthy friends with connections. I had a legal pad, a bank statement I'd found in a shoebox, and the words of a private bank manager ringing in my ears. He left instructions. What instructions? To whom? Beneficiaries? Patricia? Doug? Some arrangement that had been carefully constructed to exclude me, his wife, his legal next of kin. I knew enough to know I knew very little, and I knew enough to know that if I moved carelessly I could lose everything. The first decision I made that morning was the most important one. I would not tell anyone what I'd found. Not my sister Karen in Pittsburgh, not my neighbor Donna, who is kind and well-meaning and constitutionally unable to keep a secret. And certainly not Patricia Hayes, who called me every other Wednesday to ask how I was managing in a voice that now sounded in retrospect like a woman keeping tabs on a situation. The second decision, I would get a lawyer. Not a general family attorney. An estate attorney. Someone who specialized in exactly this. Contested estates, hidden assets, post-death financial discovery. Someone who would not be impressed by a private bank's polished composure and would know what questions to ask. The third decision was harder, and I sat with it for a long time at my kitchen table as the Columbus morning came gray and quiet through the window. The third decision was this. I would go to Chicago. I would walk into First Meridian Private Bank. I would sit across from Gerald Bloom and I would find out what my husband's instructions were. But I would not go unprepared. And I would not go alone. I opened my laptop. I searched. Estate Attorney, Columbus, Ohio. Hidden assets. Deceased spouse. I wrote down 3 names from 2 different websites that mention probate litigation specifically. Then I closed the laptop, showered, dressed in the most composed thing I owned, a charcoal blazer I wore to faculty meetings, and drove to the public library because I didn't want to make these calls from my home phone. The woman who walked into that library was someone I didn't quite recognize yet. She was frightened. She was exhausted. She had spent the night dismantling 26 years of her own memory. But she had a plan. The attorney's name was Margaret O'Shea. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building on East Broad Street in Columbus. And it was the kind of office that communicated seriousness without theater. Law books, a clean desk, 2 chairs that were comfortable without being luxurious. She was 51, Ghanaian American, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she took off and set down before she spoke, which I would come to understand meant she was about to say something that required your full attention. I sat across from her on a Thursday morning and laid everything on the table. The bank statement, my notes, the timeline of Richard's death and estate, the 3 words Gerald Bloom had said. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she put her glasses back on, looked at the statement once more, and then looked at me. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, you were right not to tell anyone, and you were right to come here before you go to Chicago. She explained my situation with a clarity that was paradoxically both calming and alarming. Under Ohio law, as Richard's surviving spouse, I was entitled to an elective share of his estate, meaning that even if his will had attempted to exclude me, I had legal rights. The key question was whether this account had been structured in a way that placed it outside the probate estate. A trust, a beneficiary designation, a business entity. Private banks sometimes helped wealthy clients structure assets in ways that were legal but designed to minimize a spouse's access. The phrase, "he left instructions," Margaret said, setting her glasses down again, tells me this account was almost certainly accompanied by some kind of directive, a letter of instruction to the bank, a named beneficiary, possibly a revocable living trust. We need to know which. She filed a formal legal request that same afternoon. A spousal rights inquiry accompanied by Richard's death certificate and our marriage certificate, directed to First Meridian Private Bank's legal department in Chicago. She also filed a request with the Cook County Probate Court for a full asset disclosure order. These were not aggressive moves, she told me. They were procedural. They were the kind of moves that put a bank on notice that a surviving spouse knew her rights. It also, Margaret said with a careful neutrality, alerts anyone who might have an interest in that account that you are aware of its existence. That was the moment I understood fully what I was setting in motion. I drove home from Margaret's office and found 2 missed calls on my landline, both from Patricia. I didn't call back. I sat in the kitchen and watched my phone and waited for it to ring again. And when it did, I let it go to voicemail. Patricia's voice was warm and practiced. "Carol, hi. It's me. Just thinking about you. Wanted to check in. Call me when you get a chance, okay? Doug sends his love." She had never mentioned Doug sending his love in 14 months of Wednesday calls. I wrote that down. The following Tuesday I drove to Chicago. I'd booked a single night in a mid-range hotel near the Loop, told no one where I was going, and left a note for my neighbor Donna saying I'd be visiting a college friend. I brought every document Margaret had told me to bring, plus copies of everything organized in 2 separate folders in case one was lost. First Meridian Private occupied the ground floor of a glass building on North Michigan Avenue. It was exactly what you'd expect from an institution that managed the money of people who didn't discuss money. Quiet, expensive, deliberately calm. A receptionist led me to a conference room. Gerald Bloom arrived 4 minutes later. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the particular composure of a man who had sat across from difficult conversations for 40 years, and had learned to show nothing. He shook my hand. He offered water. He sat down. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. Now that your attorney has been in contact with us, we've been expecting this meeting." He placed a document folder on the table between us. The account, he explained, had been established in 2003, 4 years into our marriage. It was held under a revocable living trust titled the Roth Family Trust. Richard was the settlor. The trust named 2 beneficiaries upon his death, Patricia Whitmore Hayes for 60% and Douglas Hayes for 40%. I was not mentioned anywhere in the document, but here was the critical detail. The thing that changed everything. The thing that made Gerald Bloom's composure slip for just a fraction of a second when he placed the second document in front of me. Under a 2018 amendment to the trust, Richard had added a single handwritten addendum. It was dated March 14, 2018. 2 weeks after my mother's hip surgery. 2 weeks after I had cried in a hospital parking lot while my husband held $33 million in a private account in Chicago. The addendum read in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. In the event my wife Carol becomes aware of this trust, full disclosure is to be made to her, and she is to be provided with independent legal counsel at the trust's expense. I believe she will know what to do. I stared at that paper for a very long time. He had known. Somewhere. Somehow in 2018, he'd written a door into the wall he'd built around me. I didn't know yet whether that made things better or worse. I didn't know yet whether it was guilt or love, or some complicated mixture of both. What I knew was this. I had my first direct evidence. And Patricia Hayes had no idea I just read it. Margaret moved quickly after Chicago. The 2018 addendum was, in her words, an extraordinary piece of evidence, because it demonstrated that Richard himself had anticipated this moment and had explicitly provided for my involvement. It didn't override the trust's beneficiary designations automatically, but it created grounds for a full probate challenge. Combined with the spousal elective share provisions under Ohio law, and a strong argument that the trust had been established using marital assets accumulated during our 26-year marriage, we had a case. We filed in Cook County Probate Court on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Patricia Hayes was calling my cell phone. I let it ring. By Friday, she was calling my landline. I let that ring too. On Saturday, Doug Hayes called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered that one because I hadn't recognized it and hadn't thought for one careless moment to check. Carol. His voice was the same as always, large, confident, the voice of a man who sold things for a living. We need to talk. Doug, I said, you should speak with my attorney. Your attorney? He said the words the way you say something that offends you. Carol, we're family. Richard would be heartbroken by this. You're dragging his memory through a court system over a private financial arrangement he made years ago. Speak with my attorney, I said again, and I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment after I hung up. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that specifically that my hands were not shaking, and I filed it away as information about myself that I hadn't known before. They arrived at my house on a Tuesday evening, both of them. Patricia in a cream-colored coat I'd seen her wear at Richard's funeral, Doug in a sport coat, both of them standing on my front porch with the careful positioning of people who'd rehearsed this. I opened the door but did not invite them in. We're not here to fight, Patricia said. Her voice was soft, grieving, expertly calibrated. Carol, we loved Richard. We want to honor what he built. But this account, this trust, was his private decision. He had his reasons. Going to court is going to cost everyone. It's going to take years. It's going to be terrible for everyone who loved him. What you're doing, Doug said, his voice dropping, is going to expose things Richard specifically didn't want exposed. Things about where that money came from. Things that could affect you too, Carol. Your reputation. Your name. I looked at him steadily. Are you suggesting that my husband's money was obtained illegally? Doug blinked. The rehearsed version of this conversation had not included that question. I'm saying, he said more carefully, that some of Richard's business arrangements were complex, private. Going through a court process means those things become public record. Then I suppose they become public record, I said. Margaret O'Shea, my attorney. You have her number. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a long moment after I heard them walk back down the porch steps. Doug's voice carried. He was saying something sharp and low to Patricia. Something that wasn't meant for me, but reached me anyway through the door. She's not going to back down. We have to call Ferris. Ferris. A name I'd never heard. I wrote it down the moment I reached the kitchen. I called Margaret the next morning and told her everything. The phone calls, the visit, Doug's implication about the money's origins, the name Ferris. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "The threat about the money's origins is a bluff. If the money had been obtained illegally, they wouldn't want a court process either. They want you scared. They want you to walk away and take nothing." She told me she'd investigate the name Ferris through the trust's financial records once we had full disclosure access. "Carol," she said before we hung up, "you did exactly the right thing. You stayed calm, you gave them nothing, and you came to me immediately." I thanked her. I hung up. And then I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I drove 30 minutes to a state park east of Columbus, parked the car, and walked along a trail for 2 hours in the October cold. No phone, no legal pads, no statements. The trees were turning, reds and golds and a particular fierce orange that Richard had always called the angry color. I teased him about that phrase every October for 26 years. I let myself be sad for a while. Not about the money. About him. About the man I'd loved and the man I apparently hadn't fully known, and the way those two things existed in me simultaneously without canceling each other out. Then I drove home, made soup, and slept for 9 hours. When I woke up, I was ready again. The offer came by certified mail, 10 days after my walk in the park. It was a formal letter from a law firm I'd never heard of, Hardcastle and Ferris LLC, based in Scottsdale, Arizona. That was the Ferris, not a person Doug had been calling. A partner in the legal firm that, it turned out, had drafted the Raw Family Trust in the first place and had been managing its administrative affairs for 2 decades. The letter was polite, almost courtly, in the way that letters written by attorneys threatening you sometimes are. It acknowledged my spousal claim. It acknowledged the 2018 addendum. And it offered me, in full and final settlement of all claims, the sum of $750,000. $750,000 from a $33 million account. I read the letter twice at my kitchen table. Then I photographed it and emailed it to Margaret. And then I did a thing I surprised myself by doing. I laughed. Not bitterly, almost with relief. Because $750,000 was, let me be precise about this, exactly 2.27% of what was in that account. It was an offer designed not to be accepted. Was an offer designed to see what kind of woman I was. I was the kind of woman who called her attorney and said, "Decline. And make sure they understand we'll see them in court." Margaret filed our formal rejection the following morning. What happened in the weeks that followed was a particular kind of silence that I had come to recognize. Patricia stopped calling. Doug stopped calling. The certified letters stopped. The front porch remained empty on Tuesday evenings. They were watching, calculating, conferring with Hardcastle and Ferris. I was in a phase of the process that Margaret called the waiting room, both sides in position, the machinery of the court in motion, nothing left to do but hold steady. I found to my own surprise that I needed people. I am not, by nature, someone who reaches easily for others. Richard's death had made me more solitary in some ways. I'd retreated into routine, into work, into the particular quiet of a house where someone used to be. But this situation was too large to carry alone, and I needed the weight distributed. I called my sister Karen. Karen is 4 years younger than me, lives in Pittsburgh, and works as a high school guidance counselor. She's practical and loving and completely without drama, which is precisely what I needed. I drove to Pittsburgh on a Friday evening and sat in her kitchen. A kitchen nothing like mine. cluttered and warm and smelling of the garlic she puts in everything. And I told her everything. She listened the way Margaret listened, completely without interrupting. When I finished, she poured us both another cup of coffee and she said, "That man, Carol, that man." She said it 3 times, each time with a different weight, and somehow those 6 syllables covered everything I'd been unable to say to anyone for weeks. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." What I needed, it turned out, was practical and simple. I needed someone who knew the full picture to be available when I called. I needed someone to talk through the emotional tangle with, not a therapist, though Margaret had gently suggested that. And she wasn't wrong, but a person who knew Richard, who had sat at our Thanksgiving table, who could hold the contradiction of him alongside me without needing me to resolve it. Karen did that. She drove to Columbus the following weekend and spent 2 days with me. We went through old photographs, not morbidly, but with the curiosity of 2 women trying to identify something that had been hiding in plain sight. We found things, small things. A receipt from a Chicago restaurant dated 2009, a weekend I hadn't known he'd taken. A phone number written on the back of a business card in the desk drawer. A Chicago area code. No name. A birthday card from Patricia dated 2015 that read, "In part, Richard, you're doing the right thing. Trust me. Love P." The right thing. Trust me. Karen photographed everything. Margaret received the photographs by email on Sunday evening, and replied at 10 p.m. with 3 words of her own. "Very good. Keep looking." I also in those weeks returned to teaching. I had 2 sections of English composition that semester and I had been, I'll admit it, distracted, arriving prepared but not quite present. I made a deliberate decision to be present again. I graded papers. I held office hours. I ate lunch in the faculty lounge and listened to my colleagues talk about their weekends and their students and the upcoming conference in Cincinnati. It sounds small. It wasn't small. There is something grounding about being useful in ways that have nothing to do with the thing threatening to consume you. My students didn't know anything about $33 million or the Roth Family Trust or Hardcastle and Ferris. They knew that their semicolons were consistently wrong, and that I'd written extensive notes in the margins of their drafts, and that I expected revision. That was enough. That was real. I drove home from campus one evening in November, and sat in the car in my driveway for a moment before going inside. The neighborhood was quiet. The trees had lost their leaves. The house, my house, looked exactly the same as it always had. I thought, I am going to win this. Not with bravado, with the calm certainty of a woman who had done her preparation, assembled her people, and was no longer afraid of what waited on the other side of a door. I went inside. I made dinner. I was ready for what came next. They came again in December. This time Patricia came alone without Doug, which I understood immediately was a strategic choice. Doug had shown his edge on the porch that October night. His implication about the money, his vaguely threatening tone. He'd been too visible, too obviously a man with something to protect. Patricia was the softer instrument, and someone Harcourt, Castle and Ferris probably had decided to deploy her. She called first. She asked if she could come by. She said she'd been thinking about Richard constantly, that she was struggling, that she just wanted to sit with someone who had loved him. Her voice carried a tremor that sounded genuine, and for a moment, I want to be honest about this, I felt the pull of it, because here is the thing about Patricia that I had to keep reminding myself. She was Richard's sister. She had loved him in her way, whatever her way was. The grief was real, even if everything else was strategic, and I had been lonely too. And Richard was gone. And there was a version of this situation in which two women who had both lost him could sit together and be sad. I let her come. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a small tin of shortbread cookies, the brand Richard had liked, and I knew even then that the cookies were calculated. She set them on the kitchen counter, and I made tea, and we sat at the table where I had sat 14 months ago reading a bank statement that had dismantled my life. For the first 20 minutes she was just Patricia. She talked about Richard as a boy, stories I'd heard before but loved because they were the only version of him from before I knew him. The time he'd broken their mother's ceramic rooster by accident and hidden the pieces in his closet for a year rather than confess. The way he'd always whistled while he cooked. I let myself be moved by those stories because they were true, and I let her see that I was moved because that was also true. Then she shifted. I felt it before she said anything. A small change in her posture. A setting down of her teacup. "Carol," she said carefully. "Richard was a complicated man. I know that's not what you want to hear right now, but he made decisions for reasons. He wasn't trying to hurt you." "I know he was complicated," I said. "The money." She stopped, composed herself. "The way he arranged things, it was never about not trusting you. It was about protecting something that was built before the two of you, that was family, that he felt a responsibility toward." "Before the two of us?" I said. "Patricia, we married in 1997. This account was opened in 2003. We were married." "I know. But there were family considerations. Things that had been understood between us for a long time before that." "What was understood?" I said. "Between you and Richard that required $33 million to be hidden from me for 20 years. She looked at me steadily. "I think you know that pursuing this in court is going to be painful for everyone, for his memory, for the family he loved." "I think," I said, "that Richard wrote a specific addendum in 2018 stating that if I ever became aware of this trust, I should be given full access to its contents and independent legal counsel." That sounds less like a man protecting a family arrangement and more like a man who was not entirely comfortable with that arrangement. Something moved across her face. Not quite anger. Something more controlled than anger and therefore more cold. "That addendum," she said quietly, "was written during a difficult period for Richard. He wasn't well that year." He was perfectly well in 2018, I said. "He golfed twice a week. He taught himself to make sourdough bread. You came to visit us in August of that year, and the three of us drove to Hocking Hills. He was well." She put her hands around her teacup. Her knuckles were white. "Carol." Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. "Not entirely, but enough. This is going to hurt you. The legal process, the discovery, the things that will come out about Richard's business associations. It will change how you remember him. How everyone remembers him. Is that what you want? Is that worth it to you? For money?" I looked at her across the table. My mother had a phrase she used, "See them clearly, not meanly, clearly." "Patricia," I said, "I have been a good wife to your brother for 26 years. I trusted him. I believed every story he told me about our financial situation. When my mother needed surgery, I cried in a parking lot while your brother had $33 million in a private account. I'm not pursuing this for money. I'm pursuing this because what was done was wrong. And because Richard himself, whatever his reasons for the original arrangement, left me a door." She stood up. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She was contained, perfectly, impressively contained, but I could see the effort it cost her. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said. "I do," I said. She left the shortbread on the counter. I closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway, and then I did something I hadn't expected. I shook. Not from fear exactly. From the expenditure of having held myself that steady for that long. I sat on the stairs and pressed my back against the wall and breathed. But as the shaking passed, something else came in behind it. Something clean and hard and warm all at once. I was not going to back down, and Patricia Hayes had just confirmed by her desperation that she already knew it. The hearing was scheduled for February, but it wasn't a trial. It was a discovery hearing in Cook County Probate Court, convened to review the full financial history of the Raw Family Trust and determine the applicable rights of all interested parties. Margaret had described it to me as the moment the other side has to stop being vague. She was right. I dressed carefully that morning. A dark navy suit I'd bought for Richard's memorial service and hadn't worn since. Sensible heels. No jewelry except my wedding ring, which I was still wearing. Not for sentiment, or not only for sentiment, but because in a hearing about what I was owed as Richard's wife, it seemed precisely relevant. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. A probate hearing room rather than a grand courtroom, but it had the weight of the law in it. The formality that made everyone sit slightly straighter. Patricia and Doug sat on the other side of the room with two attorneys from Hardcastle and Ferris. Patricia wore black. Doug wore a suit that was slightly too expensive for the occasion, the way Doug always was. They didn't look at me when I came in. Margaret had obtained, through the discovery process, 3 years of financial records from the trust. What those records contained had been shared with me the week before the hearing, and I had read through them twice at my kitchen table with a highlighter and a legal pad, making notes in the margins the way I marked my students' essays. Carefully, looking for the underlying structure of the argument. The underlying structure, it turned out, was damning. The trust had been funded primarily through a series of investments Richard had made beginning in 2001 using capital that was, beyond any legal ambiguity, marital property. Money deposited into our joint account from his salary, the salary I believed was modest, had been systematically diverted into a separate account maintained under a business entity called Raw Logistics Consulting, LLC, before being transferred quarterly into the trust. For 20 years, Richard had been paying himself a real salary from the company's operations and reporting only a portion of it to our joint household. The rest, accumulating over 2 decades with investment returns, had become $33 million. Margaret presented this to the court with the specific calm of someone who has done an enormous amount of work and knows it. Then Hardcastle and Ferris's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Leonard Cade, argued that the trust's assets were entirely Richard's separate business proceeds and not subject to spousal claims. He was precise. He was confident. And then Margaret asked the court to admit Exhibit 14, bank transfer records showing that the initial capitalization of Raw Logistics. Press her lips together in a way I had never seen her do before. The expression of someone watching something they cannot stop. The judge, a compact, precise woman in her 60s named the Honorable Denise Fogarty, asked Cade directly whether the trust's funding documentation could confirm the source of the initial capitalization. Cade said he would need to review the specific transfer. "Mr. Cade," Judge Fogarty said, with the patience of a woman who had seen this particular delay tactic many times, "the transfer is dated June 14, 2001. It originated from a joint checking account held by Richard and Carol Whitmore. We have the bank record. I'd like your client's response. There was a pause. Across the room, Doug Hayes was very still. Leonard Cade said, "The trust's position is that Mr. Whitmore had authority over joint funds and used that authority in a manner consistent with his role as primary earner in the household." "Mrs. Whitmore," said Judge Fogarty, turning to our table, "was this withdrawal discussed with you?" Margaret stood. "Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore has a sworn affidavit confirming she was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania during the week of that withdrawal. She also has documentation showing she was unaware of Raw Logistics Consulting LLC until these proceedings." I sat at that table and I held myself very still. I did not look at Patricia. I did not look at Doug. I looked at Judge Fogarty and I let the facts do their work. The unraveling when it came was not theatrical. It was methodical. Over the next 2 hours, Cade's position shifted by degrees from confident assertion to careful qualification to something that sounded increasingly like retreat. Margaret pressed each concession. The trust's initial funding, marital assets, the ongoing transfers documented, systematic, concealed from the marital estate. The 2018 addendum, Richard's own acknowledgement that Carol had a right to know. At one point Patricia was asked directly by the judge's clerk to confirm her understanding at the time of the trust's creation that it was funded by marital assets. Her attorney objected. The judge sustained the objection, but the question had been asked and it sat in the room. Doug Hayes looked for the first time in our long acquaintance genuinely uncertain. The practiced confidence was gone. He kept his eyes on the table in front of him, and he did not look up when Margaret concluded her presentation, and he did not look up when the judge said she would render a preliminary ruling within 15 days. When we stood to leave, Patricia finally looked at me. Just for a moment. Her face was composed. She was always composed. I'll give her that. But her eyes were a particular kind of empty that I recognized. It was the look of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has just felt it begin to slip. I nodded to her the way you nod to someone you have nothing more to say to. Margaret and I walked out into the February cold of North Michigan Avenue. The lake was gray and enormous at the end of the street. "She'll rule in our favor," Margaret said quietly. I believed her. Judge Fogarty's preliminary ruling came on a Thursday morning, 12 days after the hearing. Margaret called me at 8:47 a.m. I was in my office at the community college between classes grading a stack of second drafts on Zora Neale Hurston. "Carol," Margaret said, "we won." I put down my red pen. The ruling was thorough, 23 pages, which Margaret walked me through that afternoon in her Columbus office. Judge Fogarty had found that the initial capitalization of the Raw Family Trust, having originated from marital joint funds without the documented knowledge or consent of Carol Whitmore, constituted a misappropriation of marital assets. The ongoing diversion of income into the trust via Raw Logistics Consulting LLC compounded this finding. While Richard had legal authority to make many financial decisions independently during the marriage, the scope and systematic concealment of these transfers crossed into a violation of fiduciary duties within the marital relationship. The trust, as structured, could not legally exclude me. Under Illinois law and applicable Ohio spousal rights provisions, my elective share of the marital estate, which the court had now properly valued at the full trust balance plus accrued investment returns, amounted to $16.9 million. $16.9 million. I sat in Margaret's office and let that number exist in the room. Leonard Cade filed an objection within 48 hours. Margaret told me this was expected, procedural, and unlikely to succeed given the quality of the evidentiary record. She was right. The objection was denied within 3 weeks. What happened next unfolded over the following 4 months with the grinding, comprehensive thoroughness of the legal system working as it was designed to work. Hardcastle and Ferris offered a settlement, $11 million. Margaret declined. They offered $13 million. Margaret declined. They offered $15 million and a stipulation that Patricia and Doug would retain the remainder of the trust without further dispute. Margaret called me. Carol, $15 million is a meaningful number. The remaining litigation will take months, possibly a year, and there's always risk in any legal proceeding. Margaret, I said, what does the ruling say we're entitled to? 16.9. Then I want 16.9. There was a brief pause. I could hear her smiling. All right, she said. We decline. Final settlement, negotiated not from a position of compromise, but from a position of documented legal entitlement, was reached in June. $16.85 million to an account in my name, with an additional $50,000 in legal fee reimbursements. Patricia and Doug retained the remaining $16 million in the trust plus accrued returns less substantial legal fees of their own. Close to $800,000 by the end, Margaret estimated, given the length and complexity of the proceedings. The day the transfer cleared, I was in my backyard in Columbus. It was a warm June morning. I had coffee. I had my neighbor Donna's tabby cat who had wandered over as she did sometimes and was sitting on the porch railing with the particular authority of cats. I looked at the number on my phone's banking app for a long time. Then I called Karen. It's done, I said. She cried. I didn't. Not then. Not at that moment. That would come later, alone in the quiet of the house. The good cry that had been waiting a long time. That moment I was simply steady, looking at my backyard in the June morning. The grass I'd been meaning to reseed along the fence line. The oak tree Richard had planted the first year we'd moved in, which was now taller than the house. Margaret had one final conversation with me before we formally closed out the engagement. She sat across from me in her clean office and took her glasses off and set them down. You should know, she said, that in 22 years of estate litigation I've had very few clients who held up the way you did. The offer at $750,000 would have broken most people. The visit from Patricia would have broken most people. You didn't flinch. I flinched, I said. I just did it in private. She smiled. That's the same thing. One more thing happened before I consider the chapter truly closed, and I want to include it because it mattered to me more than the money. 2 weeks after the settlement, I drove back to First Meridian Private Bank in Chicago. I had called ahead and asked to meet with Gerald Bloom. He received me in the same conference room, the same table, the same water glass. I placed the copy of Richard's 2018 handwritten addendum on the table between us. I believe she will know what to do. He came here in 2018 to add this? I asked. He did, Gerald Bloom said. He came alone. He was very quiet. He didn't explain his reasons. Did he seem I stopped? What word was I looking for? Guilty? Remorseful? Afraid? Did he seem like a man who had made peace with something? Gerald Bloom considered that for a moment. He was a careful man. A lifetime of care in that face. He seemed, he said slowly, like a man who wanted to leave something right. I thanked him. I drove back to Columbus. I sat in the oak tree's shade in my backyard, and I let my husband be complicated, and I let myself be the woman who had survived it. Strange the way a life restructures itself around a new truth. You think the money will change everything at once. Doesn't. It changes slowly in layers, not with a single dramatic announcement, but with 100 small shifts you only recognize looking back. The first thing I did was the washing machine. Not because I needed to. The old one still worked, but because I wanted to stand in a Home Depot and choose the best one without looking at the price tag first. I stood in the laundry room afterward and felt something I had no word for. Not triumph. The relief of a restraint finally released. I worked with a financial advisor to build a structure for the money that would serve me long term. Trust of my own. Investments. A small charitable foundation covering medical costs for families who couldn't afford necessary surgery. Named for my mother, whose hip replacement had sent me crying to a hospital parking lot, while $33 million sat in Chicago. I traveled. Portugal with Karen. Lisbon. Bread. I'll never stop thinking about miles. Walked before the heat came. Scotland alone in November, which I'd been afraid to do and turned out to be something I was very good at. I kept teaching. I developed a writing workshop for adult learners returning after significant life breaks. Divorce, illness, loss. 9 students the first semester. 3 of them stayed an hour after the final class just to keep talking. That course still fills every semester. As for Patricia and Doug Dutton, the legal fees, nearly $900,000 by final accounting, had cracked something in their Scottsdale life. The house with the pool was sold. Doug's business brought in a partner under unfavorable terms. Patricia moved to Phoenix. I felt no satisfaction in this. I felt distance. The clean earned distance of a woman who had closed a chapter properly. Richard. I thought about often. The man with the secret and the man who'd left me a door existed alongside the man who'd brought me coffee on Saturday mornings. Marriage is a living record, and mine contained more deception and more love than I had known. The oak tree he planted our first year is very tall now. I had a bench placed beneath it. Some mornings I sit there and I think the woman who found that envelope did all right. Did you like this story? Which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this, support the channel with a super thanks so I can keep bringing you more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next one.